She stood in my kitchen holding my coffee like it was hers when my own son said,
If you don't like living with us, leave.
That was the moment the floor went out, when respect died in the house I built, when a whisper of bitter almond on my mug told me betrayal wasn't just thoughtless, it was planned. What followed was a quiet war, a fake doctor, a forged deed, a deep-faked me nodding on a bank screen, and a paper trail I turned into a blade. This is how I took my name, my money, and my home back, one timestamp at a time. Before we dive into today's story, let us know where you're watching from. And as you watch, don't just sit back, be part of the experience. If a moment grabs you, powerful, unexpected, or deeply moving, drop a comment with the timestamp and your thoughts. Your reactions bring the story to life, and we love seeing what resonates most. If you haven't already, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now grab a coffee or tea, settle in, and let's begin. At daybreak, the meadow below my porch looked like a sheet of hammered tin, the frost catching first light and throwing it back up the slope. I set the cast iron kettle on the blue flame, listened for the soft rattle before it settled, and cracked the kitchen window so the air brought in pine resin and last night's wood smoke. The old AM radio on the shelf crackled through static about a flare-up east of the county line, nothing urgent yet, winds out of the northwest, humidity low. I marked it down in my ledger. Date, temperature, wind direction, a small note about the fox prints I'd seen skirting the compost pile. Ranger habits do not retire, they just slow their pace. The cabin holds a map of the ridge like another window. I tacked it myself years ago, a topo spread above the kitchen table with trail pins like a sprinkled constellation. The logs in the walls are patched where winter pries at the seams. Every spring I find another task and fit it into the long day. Re-chink, sand, oil, repeat. The place is quiet enough to hear the stovepipe flex as heat climbs. On a good morning, the world arranges itself into a list I can manage. Brew, note, sharpen the axe, split around, stack it straight, sweep. I did not move here to hide. After my wife died, the cabin became the only room large enough for my grief and small enough to keep me honest. I fixed what I could fix and let the rest take the time it needed. That first winter alone, I learned that solitude is work. You feed it with tasks, with steady hands, with the willingness to hear your own breath. I have lived most of my life reading weather and reading people. Weather is easier. Grace came with Nolan in late spring, a suitcase in each hand and a promise that sounded like a light held up to a dark hall. A few weeks, Dad, just until the project lands. Weeks slip in a clean line when you do not put stakes in the ground. Their gear found corners, first the spare room, then the hall, then the bench by the door where my boots used to sit alone like two tired dogs. I told myself it was good to have company, that the house liked a second voice. The ledger told another story. The utilities that autopay from my pension bumped up, then bumped again. The store membership statement began to list craft beer I do not drink and camping gear that never left its boxes. Gas receipts came more often. Groceries vanished faster than the pantry filled. I did not accuse or lecture. I just wrote it down line by line because numbers are a way of telling the truth without raising your voice. Nolan holds a phone like a stage prop. He paces the living room during games with the sound off, muttering through what I can only assume are deals built from air and deadlines that move like mirages. The way he toggles from charm to impatience tells me he has rehearsed both. Grace does the dishes late, letting water run until the steam fogs the window. When I try to pin a date to temporary, she kneads the dishcloth and says they just need a little more time. I can hear my wife remind me to choose patience. I try. Elk Ridge is a place where people nod in parking lots and ask, "How's the trail?" without expecting a story. Retirees, weekend hikers, a few ranch families who have been here longer than roads. We keep our distance like a courtesy. I like that. It fits the way I was trained to move. Observe, don't intrude, step in only when stepping in keeps someone from losing more than they can afford. Independence is more than a principle for me. It is how I greet the day. I do not owe anyone a picture of how I live, but I owe the life itself the respect of good order. The stove stacked, the porch swept, the ledger squared, the tools put away where my hands will reach them blind in the dark if they have to. A house shows you when you are slipping. It leaves a screw on the floor, a hinge that squeals, a light bulb that dies and stays dead a week. I do my best not to make the house say my name like a warning. Certain objects prove their worth by being quietly where they belong. In the desk drawer, the deed sits in a plastic sleeve with the spare keys and my wife's wedding band in a cloth pouch she sewed when her hands still loved needles. In the loft, a big suitcase gathers dust, a relic from road trips that had routes and returns. On the wall, the topo pins make their small geometry of control and intention. I notice these things the way a man notices whether his bootlaces are still good. The morning I am remembering now, I walked the perimeter while the kettle cooled, checked the woodpile, tapped the propane gauge, and breathed the sharp air that tells you winter is not given up even when the calendar says it should. When I came back in, I set the enamel mug by the ledger and underlined the wildfire note, a habit from years of briefing crews who needed the short version before sunup. I paused at the map and pressed my palm flat to smooth a curling edge. The paper gave a little, then lay still. There are signs when something begins to tilt. You feel a thread pull tight between what you expect and what is happening in your own kitchen. The house was too warm for the hour. The television remote lay where it never used to, on top of my field guide to birds. A pair of nylon hiking pants, still with the tag draped over a chair. None of it is a crime. Taken together, it is a drift. A truck door thumped close. Tires on the gravel made the small avalanche sound I can place with my eyes closed. Footsteps came up the switchback, then up the stairs, then across the porch. The knob turned before the second knock. Noonlight slid across the sink and made the steel throw white at the edges. I could hear the tab snap on a beer can and the soft hiss. Grace hovered at the dishes with her back to the room, shoulders tight enough to telegraph everything she was not saying. I set my pencil down in the gutter of the ledger so it would not roll. I looked once at the topo map, the pins keeping their silent order, and once at the window where frost had given up to water. When I turned, Nolan filled the doorway like a man who had paid a mortgage I had paid. He lifted the can, took a swallow, and wiped the foam with his knuckle. He smiled like a man who has practiced the expression more times than he has earned it, and the air in the kitchen drew itself smaller, waiting for a sentence to land. I inhaled, steady until the breath filled the place patience keeps, and braced for what he would say next. He said it the way men test a fence to see if the post will give. The beer hissed in his hand, hops floating over the lemon cleaner Grace favored, and the sentence landed in the middle of my kitchen as if the deed in my desk were a napkin. If you don't like living with us, leave. I watched the words settle, felt the house shrink around them. Grace's shoulders tightened over the sink, water clattering against plates long after they were clean. I did not argue. Argument is wind, action sets stakes. I stepped past him, past the nylon pants still tagged and the portable speaker winking from the counter, and climbed the loft ladder. Dust rose when I pulled the big suitcase forward. It thumped the floor with the same finality as a split round taking the wedge. I carried it into the spare room and began to pack their things, jackets that had only met weather between the door and the car, shoes colonizing the mat, chargers braided like vines across my outlets. Zippers rasped, steady, a metronome for a different kind of patience. From the doorway, Nolan's voice pitched itself higher, glassy with offense, that I had taken his instructions seriously. His phone appeared as quickly as the indignation. He dialed with his thumb and turned his face to find the panicked register people reserved for strangers. I heard him say my name, misstate my age, toss the word unhinged into the air like confetti. Grace said my name once, small and helpless, but did not step between us. I noted the time on the stove clock without meaning to. I always note the time. Gravel announced the cruisers before their lights found the porch windows. Cold air folded into the room when the door opened, pine, exhaust, the metallic bite of snow still clinging to the shaded ditch. Two deputies stood with hands low and visible. An EMT hovered, polite, waiting to be needed. I gave my name and date of birth before anyone asked, the county, the address. Years of briefing crews trained me to speak in the order a pen expects. Nolan had an iPad ready, a face already framed when he turned the screen. The telehealth psychiatrist blinked at me through a lag. He mispronounced my last name, then called me sir with a practiced gentleness that has no use for names. He spoke of concerns reported by family, of paranoid ideation, of a temporary observation window. 72 hours said like a shrug. When asked his location, he gave a city and no street. When asked his license, he gave letters and no number. I tapped the voice recorder on my phone and let it disappear into my flannel pocket. First-person consent in a first-person life. When the EMT turned to me, I answered the orienting questions as if we were both trying to get off the mountain before weather took it back. Today's date, the time to the minute, the wind from the northwest, humidity low, last meal a bowl of oatmeal with raisins, the names of the two trails cutting north from the switchback. His pen hesitated, either to keep up or because he had run out of lines. I crossed to the desk, pulled the plastic sleeve, and laid the deed flat on the table where the iPad could see it. Ownership for decades, no lease, no tenancy arrangement, no transfer. I kept my voice even. A house responds to the voice you use inside it. I told them I was packing the belongings of my adult daughter and her husband because they had instructed me to leave my own home if I did not enjoy their company. The deputy on the left glanced at the other, not quite a smile, not quite a frown, something like the expression a man makes when he finds a map and realizes he's been using the wrong road. I put Dana Morales on speaker. Her hello was sharp enough to cut paper. I summarized in a dozen words. 8 months, no rent, telehealth pushing a hold. She asked for the teledoc's NPI and state licensure, requested badge numbers for the call log, offered to patch in a supervisor if anyone was about to make a decision they could not defend later. Procedure came into the room like a neutral third party. The deputy's shoulders dropped a fraction. Nolan tried again with stories about me forgetting, 2 vague afternoons he described with a flourish. I opened the ledger and pointed to the times I had been on the South Loop, where the trail rises in switchbacks and cell service drifts off like a flock. Numbers again telling the truth without raising their voice. The EMT noted orientation intact and vitals stable. The teledoc dodged the question he had already been asked, then recommended cooling off as if he had issued a prescription. They did not compel transport. They logged the check and left the door open to cold and quiet. The iPad face blinked away in a soft click. I closed the deed sleeve, slid it back into the drawer with the same care I used for my wife's ring. The house exhaled, but not fully. Relief is a half step when the ground still gives under your heel. On the counter, the mug from that morning still smelled faintly of almonds. I had thought it a flavored creamer Grace found on sale. The note stuck to the back of my tongue in memory, not accusation. I filed it away the way I file weather, not yet a storm, not to be ignored. Beside the mug lay an envelope with the HOA logo fat in one corner. I registered the sender, the weight of the paper, and set it under my palm without opening it. Drift becomes pattern because you keep pretending each piece is only itself. Nolan traced a ring in the condensation his can left and wiped it with 2 fingers, a small smear that refused to vanish. Grace shut off the water as if she had remembered the bill was mine. The suitcase waited on the spare bed, half-zipped, a verdict that made no sound. Dana texted to document everything. Don't confront. She would start with licensure and call logs and whatever else draws a line straighter than outrage can. I saved the recording into a labeled folder and wrote a clean summary in the ledger. Names, times, what was said, who stood where. Then I pulled the thin file of bills and statements and opened the laptop. Autopays blinked their easy approval across the screen like turnstiles. Authorization repeated itself like a benediction. I set a fresh envelope on the desk and wrote Dana's name on it in block letters my old crew could read in smoke. The fight had left the kitchen. It was already waiting in the paperwork. Afternoon flattened the rooms the way snow flattens a meadow. The half-zipped suitcase waited on the spare bed like a verdict. I walked the house, the phone camera clicking at corners, the kitchen table, the iPad smear where a doctor's face had floated. I logged times in my ledger, arrival, questions asked, the telehealth push for 72 hours, the mispronounced last name. On speaker, Dana's tempo was procedure. She wanted the CAD number from dispatch badge numbers, the length of the call, the teledoc's name letter by letter. "I have your back," she said. "Collect your core papers. Driver's license, deed, insurance, any directives, and my will in one fire-safe sleeve. No transport without cause, no signature without counsel. Write it down and let me carry the law," Dana said. I poured water and watched my hand hold steady. I measured orientation, date, time, county, the nearest mile marker, the grid coordinates printed on the map. I wrote them down to remind myself what it feels like when a body is a witness and not a question. The laptop turned the wood grain pale. Auto-pays lined the screen, a series of yeses I had not consciously given. Utilities ticked upward. The internet showed an upgrade I did not request, wrapped in a bundle I could not name. The bank portal presented 2 e-sign authorizations with language that sounded specific but opened the door wide. Long-term care coordination, temporary fiduciary facilitation. I printed both and circled the phrases that were all slope and no guardrail. In the living room, Nolan set a game to mute and let the crowd swell and fall like weather. He made a quick speaker call. "We'll get him seen," then dropped to a murmur. Grace stacked plates like bricks. I did not accuse. I made a note, background theater, lines rehearsed for an audience that had already left. I rinsed the morning mug and the almond bitter echo found the back of my tongue again, thin as a thread. I filed it like weather that could become weather, a mental sticky note to watch the sky. I set the mug aside, took a clean enamel cup. In the morning, I would pour my own. I texted Wyatt the teledoc's full name and the clinic he had claimed. He sent a screenshot, state board page stamp suspended, and a second image of a postal center with a wall of aluminum boxes. He texted that it looked like a fast hold scam and told me not to be alone for any evaluations. "Text me if anyone shows up," he added. The cabin leaned back to level a notch, the way a trailer does when you set the jack right. Hardening a home does not require paranoia. I mounted a trail cam beneath the porch beam where the IR blink would be swallowed by shadow, aimed a second at the switchback, and took a test shot. The timestamp printed clean. Inside, I changed the Wi-Fi password, killed the guest network, and checked the router's device list. One name did not belong. A smart plug I had never installed. I bagged it and labeled date and time. I slid deed, IDs, and the fresh printouts into a fireproof pouch, then wrote a chain of custody line in the ledger for anything I had bagged or moved. Dana called with a shape for what I was feeling. The playbook, she said, starts with a telehealth note and a welfare check. If that fails to move the person, an emergency psych hold gets pushed on thinner reeds. Inside a hospital, a temporary guardianship filing rides the clock. The filings use care words where control words should be. She asked me to get a clean medical baseline in the morning, vitals, orientation, capacity, because paper respects paper. By midnight, the house cooled to its true size. Grace stood in the doorway, arms folded as if she were holding in a sentence. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I'm steady," I said. "I'm writing it all down." She nodded, almost spoke, then lifted a hand to her mouth and turned away. I did not follow. I added a line to the ledger. Grace, hesitation, not help. I wrote an incident summary. Times, names, statements, what devices were present, who touched what. The printout slid into an envelope addressed to Dana Morales in block letters I could read from a truck cab. On the desk, an HOA envelope waited with its officious logo. Heavy stock like a hand on a shoulder you hadn't invited. "Open it in the morning, not tonight," Dana had said. I left it for morning. A man does not have to open every fight before breakfast. Locks checked, trail cam blink tested, phone set to allow only Dana and Wyatt through the night. In bed, solitude kept its small, honest sounds. I slept because I had filed the day where it belonged. Before dawn, I woke with the stove. I brewed coffee and wrote the plan. Clinic for the capacity baseline, Dana's office with the envelope, then the bank to freeze what could be frozen. I lifted the mail. The HOA logo stared back. The stock was heavier than it needed to be, the font officious, the return address neat enough to pass for authority. I slid the knife under the flap and felt the paper give with a clean, deliberate rip. I opened the HOA envelope in the first gray light, the knife drawing a clean seam that felt more surgical than domestic. The paper was heavier than it needed to be, embossed logo in the corner, a serifed seriousness that pretends to be law. Inside, the letter used neighborly words to do impersonal work, concerns, erratic behavior, disturbances. 2 paragraphs later, it drifted into medicine, recommending assisted observation for the safety of the community. Homeowners associations do not practice psychiatry. I noticed a signature block that looked pasted, a job title without an office address, and an attachment labeled professional statement. The attachment was a single paragraph in clinical voice with no identifying number, no letterhead, only my name spelled correctly and my dignity handled like a loose handle. I photographed each page, front and back, then the envelope with the postmark, then my watch beside it for time. In the ledger I wrote where I stood, which window admitted the light, and that coffee was my own, poured by my hand. I slid a chain of custody slip under a paper clip on a manila folder and dated it. The act of filing steadied me more than caffeine. I texted images to Dana and set the originals on the desk in a clear sleeve, as if sunlight could bleach their intent. Wyatt's message landed with a chime, a link to the neighborhood Facebook group, and a screenshot of my face caught mid-swing at the woodpile. The caption called me confused old man up on Elk Ridge with an axe, advised caution, and urged someone to get professionals to evaluate before someone gets hurt. The phrases matched the HOA letter almost word for word, including the clumsy assisted observation. I captured the thread as full-page screenshots with visible URLs and timestamps, then clicked the comments open until the page stuttered. Anonymous profiles advocated for wellness checks. One user claimed to be a medical worker and encouraged immediate intervention. I did not argue. Arguing adds fuel to a fire you didn't start. I documented. The router logs told their own story. Yesterday afternoon, around the time the HOA complaint would have been filed, outbound traffic spiked from my IP address. I exported the device list and found the unfamiliar smart plug still recorded, even though I had bagged it the night before. I noted its MAC address and added it to the drop packet. If my network had been used to prime the trap, that would be one more line in a chain that prefers to work in shadows. Wyatt replied that HOA submissions often pass through web forms that record time and IP. Dana said she would subpoena those logs. Paper against paper again. Grace set 3 bowls on the counter and slid the cereal box forward without meeting my eye. She saw the HOA logo, flinched so small a motion might have been a draft, and looked away. I marked the reaction without weaponizing it. Recognition, avoidance, I wrote later, because naming things sometimes keeps them from growing larger than they are. At the clinic, the nurse took vitals while I watched the second-hand circle, the simple honesty of numbers asserting itself. The physician came in, asked the orientation questions, and I answered them with the same economy I used on the mountain. Date, time, county, nearest mile marker, wind from the northwest. He asked me to subtract by 7s. I gave him trail names instead, both correct. He smiled, typed, and printed a note that read, "Alert and oriented X4, stable mood, no cognitive concerns, recommend routine follow-up." I asked for the time-stamped portal entry and slid both copies into my folder. Paper respects paper. I thanked him for respecting that I was there to speak for myself. Back home, I labeled the new folder and nested it next to the telehealth recording summary. I laid out the auto-signed PDFs I had printed in the last chapter and found the language that looked like scaffolding for a power of attorney without having the courage to say it: temporary fiduciary facilitation, coordination of care resources. I highlighted those phrases and underlined dates. Then I drew a timeline on a single sheet: Nolan's ultimatum, my suitcase, the 911 call, the deputy's arrival, the iPad doctor, the non-transport decision, the HOA letter, the Facebook post. I wrote the times in a thin column and the facts in a thicker one. Seeing it all at once turned anger into lines I could follow. Dana's plan arrived in a measured voice that sounded like someone setting flags on a windy ridge. She would alert the sheriff's legal liaison to the teledoc's suspended license, copy consumer protection on the HOA's deceptive language, and begin the request for HOA web form logs. Then she asked me to seed a rumor. The bait should be small but shiny. I had sold a set of nature photos to a magazine and was figuring out how to keep the money safe from family misunderstandings. The kind of detail that travels where it needs to travel without ever appearing in print. I called an old trail volunteer from the truck in the clinic parking lot with my recorder on and my tone light. I said the magazine thing had come through and I was thinking about asset safety because you never know with family, then changed the subject to the trail's washed-out culvert. At the co-op, I mentioned the same good news within earshot of people who carry news as a favor to themselves. I bought coffee beans and nothing else. I set quiet rules for the house: pour my own drinks, lock my desk every time I closed it, keep the key in my pocket, carry my phone from room to room, keep the porch light on at dusk and the trail cam humming. I did not bring up the HOA letter or the post. I cooked dinner, washed my plate, wished them a good night. The absence of confrontation was not surrender, it was a way to keep the air clear enough to hear footsteps. Before arranging the folder for Dana, I exported the Facebook thread to a PDF that preserved names and the rhythm of the pile-on. I added the clinic note, router logs, telehealth summary, the timeline, and a USB drive of screenshots. The packet felt heavier than paper ought to. A house can become an evidence locker if you let it, so I placed the packet in a drawer and reminded myself I still lived here. Late afternoon loosened into the kind of light that makes edges kind. Tires whispered on the switchback. A woman I had never seen paused at the porch with a tote bag and a careful smile, well-dressed without being flashy. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, "I'm Polly from a faith-based seniors support group. Do you have a minute to chat about protecting yourself?" I watched the trail cam's invisible eye, felt the plan click forward, and opened the door with the same hand I used to steady a map when the wind kicks up. Polly appeared in the late afternoon light as if the porch had conjured her from rumor. The tote hung neat from her shoulder, pamphlets fanned inside like prayer cards. Her smile landed in the space people reserve for condolence and caution, equal parts concern, and intent. She said she was with a faith-based seniors support group and had heard I might be thinking about ways to keep myself safe. I let the screen door ease back on its spring and listened to her cadence, the balanced sentence, the kind eyes that had learned how to hold a gaze just long enough to invite an answer. I kept my posture open. The badge lanyard at her neck showed no organization logo, just a laminated card with a first name printed larger than the last. The phone number on her pamphlet looked stamped, not pre-printed, the ink sitting raised on the cheap stock. She referenced community concerns and gently the good news about my photo sale, bait I had tossed into the current the day before. I suggested we talk longer where the town already meets, the church hall in the valley, noon, folding chairs and bad coffee. She agreed with a relief that read as rehearsal. The church smelled of sugar and old varnish. Stained glass softened the noon sun into squares across the floor. Coffee urns hissed beside a stack of styrofoam cups. Someone had taped a bake sale flyer next to a poster about blood pressure checks. Dana waited in a car under the cottonwoods, a legal pad on her knee, the recorder in my button mic already linked and steady. Polly arrived first, then brought in a man with a leather portfolio and a handshake that had practiced the exact amount of pressure that people write about as reassuring. "This is Calvin," she said. "He helps seniors protect their assets." Calvin sat with his back to the window so the light favored him. He opened with statistics, generic and unlabeled, about the epidemic of elder financial abuse. He set the problem on the table, square and heavy, then slid his solution into place beside it, a senior asset shield. The shield needed a temporary power of attorney for processing, a transfer of liquid assets to a holding account for 2 weeks, and a small processing fee that he would specify once we completed intake. He arranged the papers before me in a choreography meant to soothe. The slick finish flashed when the air moved. He squared each page with the next. The click of his pen had the steadiness of a metronome. The language wore friendly clothes while hiding large permissions. Full authority to initiate, manage, and conclude financial transactions deemed necessary for protection. Medical coordination permissions when indicated. Expiration occurred when the planner determines the shield has done its work. No date certain, no bank named. The custodian box held a national brand with no branch listed, just a logo and a promise. I felt the ledger in my head turn a clean page and bracket phrases in red I did not own. He said time might be of the essence. He had seen family disputes accelerate. He had seen guardianship pushed on good men who just needed a buffer, and he had seen regret come from hesitation. He kept control of the folder, tilting it toward me rather than handing it over, his palms steady on the corner as if he were both offering and anchoring. Polly added a story about a widow who almost lost everything, nameless and date-free, but calibrated to my age and geography. She set her hand on the folder too, a choreography for 2. The mic in my button caught Dana's text prompts as a soft pulse against my chest. Ask entity legal name, ask for bonding and registration, confirm custodial bank and FDIC certificate, ask how the power of attorney terminates. I spoke the questions aloud as if curious in the ordinary way of a man who has repaired his own roof. What's the firm's legal name and registration? Are you bonded? Which bank will custody the holding account? Do you have the FDIC certificate? When does the POA end specifically? Calvin smiled with a patience that had paid for itself many times. Confidentiality, he said. We can arrange all of that after we begin. The process moves smoother when we are already engaged to act on your behalf. References to, of course. He offered a mailbox suite address and a telephone tree instead of a door. The bank he named was real. The branch he refused to name. The POA ended when I determined the threat has passed. He said it so gently, it almost sounded like kindness. Polly leaned closer. It helps to have someone in your corner, she said, especially if, God forbid, you had to be observed for a day or 2. She let the phrase hang like laundry. Calvin nodded at the implication without speaking it aloud. Even if something happened, the shield would remain. Control beyond consent was the point dressed as protection. I asked for 3 client references I could call before signing anything. I asked for a 1-page fee schedule I could take with me. He showed me the page and did not let go of it. He mentioned processing costs and the hassle he was saving me, the phone calls, the hours, the paperwork. He framed his fee as a kindness, his authority as a relief. His cologne was faint and clean. A hospital visitor sticker had left a ghost on the spine of his portfolio like a watermark. I read best in my own light, I said. Bring the final paperwork to the cabin tomorrow afternoon. I'll make coffee and we can spread the pages where the glare doesn't boss the eyes. I added that glare in halls makes lines swim for me. True enough on days when the sun hits wrong. He hesitated and I watched the risk matrix run behind his eyes. Home field for me, control for him. That's fine, he said. I'll bring the temporary power of attorney and the custodial forms so we can keep things moving. Time is not our friend in these situations. Polly's smile gentled. Will Grace be there? She asked, careful with the question. Family alignment helps. I let the answer land neutral. We'll see. The recorder took the words and put them where they belonged. I gathered pamphlets with just my fingertips so the edges would stay sharp in my mind later. Calvin slid me a business card with raised ink and no physical office. Polly thanked me for my time as if she were leaving a casserole. Under the portico, the wind lifted the corners of their literature and rang the bell without anyone's hand on the rope. In the cottonwood shade, Dana slid a small kit across the passenger seat. One visible notepad camera, one concealed recorder, spare batteries, and a list. "Home field," she said, and I nodded. Back at the cabin, I cleared the table until the wood showed its old scars. I checked the trail cam angle, the porch boards that talk when stepped just so, the locks that speak in clean metal. I set a legal pad and 2 pins side by side and placed a clean enamel mug where a guest would expect it to be. The house steadied its breath the way a crew does on a ridge when the wind turns and the fire shows its real shape. The map on the wall lay flat under my palm, and the pins held their small geometry. Tomorrow they would bring the shield. I would let them spread it out where the light is honestly bright. Late morning drew a clean bar of light across the kitchen table and told the dust to stand up. I cleared the surface to bare wood and wiped until the cloth came away honest. A legal pad sat square with the edge, 2 pins parallel like rails, a clean enamel mug where a guest would expect it. I walked the small circuit I trust, porch board that tattles, latch that closes with a faithful click, window crack to pull resin and cold air through the room, then stood a moment to let the house remember who owns it. Dana's kit lay open like a carpenter's box. The visible notepad camera looked like any other pad unless you knew where to look. I angled its small eye toward the chair Calvin would claim. The concealed recorder slid behind the topo map frame, high enough to hear each page turn, low enough to dodge glare. My phone was set to auto-record on any ring. For chain and memory, I photographed the setup, devices placed, angles marked, wall clock and frame, and saved the images with timestamps. The deed copy, my license, and the clinic baseline note went into a folder within reach. Not for waving, for anchoring. A person in his own house with papers that say what they mean. Wyatt texted he was 10 minutes down the road. Dana replied without drumroll. Observers in position, redundant audio, code phrase confirmed. If I said the glare's too strong and rose to straighten the blinds, her team would move from standby to approach. It sounded theatrical until I remembered an iPad doctor who could not state a license and an HOA letter prescribing observation like it was lawn care. I brewed coffee I would pour for myself alone. The guest mug would stay empty until signatures were refused and the room proved friendly again. Hospitality shouldn't outrun safety. I wrote that on the top corner of the pad and underlined it once. Tires whispered on the switchback. The trail cam blinked where I couldn't see. Calvin's shoes arrived first, polished without being new. His leather portfolio followed like a statement of purpose. Polly walked a half step behind, tote and careful smile set to thaw resistance. We traded brief handshakes. I seated them so the notepad camera had the angle it needed and took the chair that left the topo map at my back. Wind brushed the roof. The stovepipe answered with a long, low-string note. Calvin opened the portfolio with a soft crackle and fanned the papers with practiced ease. Temporary power of attorney already flagged at the signature line. Custodial holding account forms. A fee page that finally showed its numbers. The language wore friendly clothes over a large appetite. Full authority to initiate, manage, and conclude transactions deemed necessary. Medical coordination when indicated. Expiration triggered by his determination that the shield had done its job. The custodian line offered a national logo without a branch. It spoke bank while avoiding a door. He framed the timing the way a man frames a doorway. Time is not our friend. Family disputes escalate. Observation won't interrupt protection. He rotated the POA toward me, aligned the pen with the line, and let the gesture work like an usher's hand. Polly placed an anecdote on the table about a widow who nearly lost everything, no names, no dates, and set her palm near the folder as if steadying it were kindness. Paper wants specifics. I asked for the bonding certificate and policy number, the firm's legal name, registration, and state file, the custodial bank's branch, and FDIC certificate. 3 client references I could call before any signature. I repeated his answers aloud so the record would catch them. He offered a mailbox suite and a telephone tree instead of a door, a national brand with no branch address, and a promise that documents arrive more easily after we begin. Polly added, almost tender, "It protects you even if you had to be observed a day or 2. Oh. I placed my palm on the clinic note in my folder and felt paper under bone. "I won't be signing today," I said. I read best when the glare isn't bossing my eyes. I stood and adjusted the blinds. The glare's too strong. His pen paused, tapped once, a sound he probably didn't hear. He tried the softer pressure. "We can begin processing while you read," he said, nudging the form closer, as if distance were my problem. The stovepipe hummed again, a steadying tone I've used for years to keep my head where my boots are. The door opened and the room changed. 2 investigators stepped in, badges level with their voices. They greeted me by name, then addressed Calvin by his full name and the list that follows men who repeat themselves for a living. The portfolio left his hands without argument. Detention pending questions on deceptive POA practices and elder fraud. Polly's smile went absent. My hand stayed visible on the table. The house remembered how to breathe. They photographed pages where they lay and asked for a clean timeline from Nolan's sentence to the church hall to this table. I gave dates, times, names, pushes, and where the paper changed hands. I showed the notepad cam and the map frame and consented to quick copies, keeping originals per Dana's guidance. I offered router logs, the HOA notice, screenshots of the neighborhood post. Evidence became inventory. Inventory became a map. Calvin's phone buzzed, an investigator tapped, and audio opened. A woman's voice came through smooth and spare, as if reading lines she had written, "If this stalls, activate Plan B." She used placement, observation, and holding account like ordinary furniture. The term placement coordinator stepped forward from the shelf where Dana had left it in my head. Grace stayed out of the room. That was by design. I had chosen exposure over reconciliation, at least for now, because truth needs air and fewer witnesses. Calvin walked out between badges. Polly went to a different corner with a different tone. I clicked the notepad. Cam dark and powered down the recorder behind the map. The table returned to being a table. Dana called before the latch finished its click. Clean capture, solid chain, good repetitions allowed. Next comes link analysis. The voice, the HOA phrasing, the telehealth name, the bank logo, the mailbox suite, thin threads woven into a net. I wrote Plan B in the ledger, circled it twice, and added the time. I pinned a note to the map frame. Custodian, no branch, mailbox suite. Evening thinned the light to a blue wash. I stacked the seizure receipt with the HOA folder and the clinic note until 3 corners sat flush, capped my pen, and let the house settle for what the bigger map would show next. Dusk settled in thin layers, the kind that turns the windows into dark mirrors and makes a room admit what it holds. On the desk, 3 corners sat flush. The seized document receipt, the HOA folder, the clinic baseline note. I wrote 1 clean line in the ledger, sting completed, Calvin detained, female voice said Plan B, and listened to the stove tick as it cooled. Outside, I pulled the trail cam card, slid it into a labeled bag, and wrote the time with the neatness my old crews expected before dawn briefings. Dana called late. Her voice had the restrained lift of good lines coming together. Calvin's firm linked to mailbox suites in 3 states, EENs that overlapped like shoe prints in damp dust. The telehealth doctor from the kitchen was confirmed suspended. The clinic address resolved to a wall of aluminum boxes. She read back phrases we already knew. Assisted observation, protective hold, processing authority. Now mapped across HOA letter, Facebook post, and Calvin's forms. Separate voices, 1 script. A digital forensics tech followed with a knock. We sat at the table with the router between us like a small dog that knows every footstep on the road. He pulled logs, highlighted a burst of outbound packets that matched the time the HOA complaint had been filed. MAC addresses spilled onto a pad, the bagged smart plug's ID matched a control app found later on Nolan's phone. I signed a consent form for artifacts and added chain of custody lines to my ledger. Evidence became inventory, inventory edged toward story. Grace moved through the kitchen like someone carrying a glass brimful. She folded a dish towel perfectly square and set it down with the care of a surgeon. Her eyes caught on the deed sleeve, then flicked away. I kept to practical boundaries. Mail to me first, I said. Desk stays locked. I pour my own drinks. She swallowed a sentence, nodded once, and left the towel where it lay. Hesitation had become a seam. On screen with Dana, the quiet drain took shape. The bank showed a pattern of microtransfers labeled coordination fees, routed through a processor tied to Calvin's EIN. 2 e-sign events I didn't remember. Temporary fiduciary facilitation pointed to my IP address at hours when the house was a chorus of other people's noise. I printed the PDFs and circled the phrases that tried to sound like guardrails while paving a slide. Then the blow that felt personal in the bone. A lender's compliance log showed a video verification where Jack Whitaker nodded through reverse mortgage disclosures. The audit flagged irregular blinks, reflections that didn't match my kitchen light, artifacts on syllables with B and P. Dana said the face likely came from a public clip. Me at a park conservation symposium years ago, scraped and trained into a mask that could agree to open a door in my own house's wall. I had spent a life trusting maps. Seeing my face used to redraw this one bent something inside me I didn't yet have a word for. We moved fast because fast was the right size. Dana pushed fraud alerts and security freezes to all 3 bureaus, faxed a revocation to the lender, demanded the full KYC trail and liveness testing logs, and typed a motion for a temporary restraining order naming Nolan for device tampering and attempted financial fraud, with a poisoning suspicion to be confirmed by a lab. The sheriff's office served a no-contact, no-trespass order for the property line. I watched the deputy sign, then watched the wind take the smell of his truck down the switchback. At night, Grace stood in the doorway and finally asked the only question that mattered. "Did the mug smell like almonds to you?" She didn't dress it in excuses. "It did," I said. "We kept it." "Dana has it." She nodded as if the answer had been inevitable since spring, then said she needed a place in town. I handed her a printed sheet, victim services, legal aid for cooperating witnesses, and did not add a speech to a decision that had to be hers. She put the paper in her pocket like a ticket and walked down the hall without touching anything. Dana laid out the likely path for the mask they'd made of me. "Public clip scraped," she said, "face model trained, synthetic KYC run through a vendor the lender uses. Router metadata puts Nolan's session live during submission. She would file with the state attorney general and the CFPB and notify the bank's BSA/AML officer. Liability, when shown the right way, can turn institutions into allies." The neighborhood thread bent back on itself. Wyatt sent fresh screenshots, locals linking to a news brief about an elder fraud ring, comments shifting from suspicion to defense. I captured the entire thread again and marked the users who had parroted HOA phrasing. Noise becomes signal when you give it a place to sit. I stood at the window and watched my reflection warp along the cold. Maps had saved me by being true. Tonight the topo pins looked like constellations and at the same time like holes a thing had already passed through. I pressed my fingertips to the glass to feel something I could name and felt only the pain give back what I gave it. The legal calendar picked up ink. Dana scheduled my formal statement with the Financial Crimes Unit, blocked time for grand jury prep in case Calvin flipped, and drafted subpoenas to the HOA board for web form logs and any emails with outside consultants. She hinted at a contractor inside county elder services funneling names, another seam to find and pull. After midnight, my phone buzzed once more. Dana forwarded an encrypted note from an anonymous employee at a senior services contractor. I can prove they script the emergency. Tell me it's safe to talk. I looked at the locked door, the trail cam's red eye, the deed sleeve still within reach, and typed one word back through Dana. Yes. The stove gave a last tick. I opened the ledger to a fresh page and drew a small square where the next line would anchor. The diner woke before the valley did. Neon hummed above the window like a patient insect. Coffee steamed against the glass, and the vinyl booth felt cool under my palm. I chose the corner bench with my back to the wall and the room in view, an old habit I'd promised myself I'd keep. Dana slid in across from me, legal pad already open, pen parked straight along the margin. The anonymous voice arrived 5 minutes later in a gray coat that had seen too many commutes and not enough sunshine. She said her name was Mara Ellison, compliance at a county contractor called Everguide Senior Services, and set a spiral notebook on the table beside a thumb drive as if the weight of them had to be shared to make the morning balance. She talked in the clipped cadence of someone who has been punished for going long. Inside Everguide, the emergency had a path. Scrape county data for widowed homeowners, run a risk flag, assign outreach to faith volunteers like Polly, pass the case to a planner like Calvin, obtain a telehealth note, seed an HOA complaint, push a welfare check, nudge an inpatient hold, file temporary guardianship, move assets under the polite cover of care. Her notebook held headings typed in a font that wanted to be liked. Emergency pathing, protective hold script, processing authority, talking points. The phrases matched my week as neatly as trail pins matched the map. She handed over the drive and asked for safety like a person asking for air. Dana promised a proffer letter and witness protections and took the drive in a motions box grip that told the moment it would not be lost. We left cash under the sugar caddy and walked into fog that smelled like river and old leaves. By mid-morning, we were at the recorder's office, a brick echo of every county building I've ever stood in. Fluorescent buzz, scanner hum, paper smell that makes a man remember not every system is a machine meant to do harm. The clerk ran my title chain and said it was clean until she reached a line that hadn't turned into paper yet. There was a pending e-recording waiting in the queue, time-stamped after hours, a quitclaim deed that would transfer my cabin to something called the Whitaker Family Care Trust with trustee Calvin Rourke. The language was syrupy with care necessity, the notary seal a digital stamp, my signature a shape I recognized the way you recognize your own face in a bad mirror. Dana moved faster than anger. She froze the queue under an emergency hold provision and demanded the notary vendor's audit trail, IP address, device fingerprint, liveness test, and the video that proved the signer was supposed to be living. Early logs came back in a trickle. The vendor was the same one the reverse mortgage lender had used. The liveness clip was the same deepfake mask of me, blinking at a cadence that had nothing to do with my pulse. I checked my watch and the crumpled receipt from the diner that still smelled like burnt sugar. The Times split the deed cleanly in two and let an alibi stand where a forgery wanted to. In the parking lot, Dana's phone lit with a lab text. The mug we'd kept held benzaldehyde and trace cyanogenic compounds, the bitter almond thread I had tasted without a word for it. Not enough to stop a heart, enough to suggest the kind of fog that makes a signature feel like a small task you can finish later. She forwarded the results to the sheriff. The numbers slid into a narrative already forming on a judge's desk. I did not let myself ask how many mornings had carried that note. By noon, paper began to move on my behalf. The bank's fraud team reversed micro-transfers labeled coordination fees and suspended the merchant account tied to Calvin's EIN. The reverse mortgage lender acknowledged the revocation, quarantined the file, flagged my profile as KYC compromised, and sent apologies that were long on compliance and short on remorse. All three credit bureaus confirmed freezes and added a fraud victim statement to my name. The clicks sounded like someone else's keyboard. I wrote the Times anyway. The smear bent back on itself. The HOA moderator posted a retraction. the neighborhood thread filled with apologies and second thoughts. Someone left an apple pie on my porch wrapped in a towel that smelled like a clean kitchen and wrote, "Maple Ridge stands with you," on a card decorated with pine cones. I photographed the note, logged the time, and left the pie on the counter until the day could prove it was safe to be casual. Grace packed with small motions meant to keep objects quiet. She left a ring of keys on the table and kept her eyes on the rim of the bowl she'd used for cereal. I set the printed resource sheet where her hand would find it first. Victim services, legal aid for cooperating witnesses, a number at Dana's office. She said, "I'm sorry," not much louder than the fridge. I nodded and unlocked the door and stood aside because sometimes respect is leaving a space for a person to choose the only path left. After the soft catch of the latch, I changed the deadbolt, updated the Wi-Fi password, removed her phone from the router list, and wrote each step in the ledger so my future self wouldn't mistake silence for forgetfulness. The courthouse clock told 2. In Dana's office, the thumb drive from Mara was already part of an inventory with hashes as precise as a GPS point. The Slack export showed language drafts with a tag, "Reduce Exposure," and a user called Line approving revisions to scripts that turned the words I'd heard in my kitchen into a product. Dana filed an affidavit attaching Mara's materials, moved to void any e-notary instrument bearing my name, drafted subpoenas for Everguide's executives, and prepared referrals to the medical board and the consumer agencies whose acronyms sound like warnings. Wyatt volunteered to drive Mara to the Attorney General. He is a man who knows how to put his body between a good witness and a bad afternoon. At home, I restored small things. I carried the suitcase up to the loft and set it where dust means storage, not escape. I replaced the portable speaker with my old shortwave and let it static stitch the room into one piece. I taped an emergency contact list inside the pantry door and penciled the sheriff's case number where I would see it every morning while the kettle worked. The house looked back like a face after a long illness, the kind where color returns and the corners learn to lift again. At twilight, a voicemail arrived from an unknown number with a single sentence, "She can't protect them all." The voice wasn't Polly's. It had the smooth, anonymized cadence of corporate training videos. I exported the file and sent it to Dana for voice print analysis, then wrote the time and the words in the ledger. Threats look smaller when they sit next to numbers. Snow began without ceremony, wide flakes erasing tracks as fast as boots could set them. Dana texted that grand jury subpoenas had issued and Calvin was negotiating. I aligned 3 folders, title and deed, KYC and bank, Everguide and scripts, and laid my palm on the topo map until the paper lay perfectly flat. Tomorrow, the house would speak in a room where rooms learn who they are. Tonight, I let it be a house again and listened to the snow find the roof. Snow packed the switchback into a quiet ribbon, and my breath turned chalk white in the cold. I set 3 folders, title and deed, KYC and bank, Everguide and scripts, into a canvas bag and checked the latch on the door twice. The cabin gave one steady creak like a hand on my shoulder. In town, the courthouse heat was dry as chalk and smelled faintly of polish and paper dust. I took a bench outside the anteroom and smoothed a stubborn curl on the topo map print I'd brought. The ridge lines and switchbacks laid out in black, the cabin a small dot at the center as if a house could raise its right hand. Dana met me with a nod and a sentence that landed like a checklist. Times, documents, what you signed and didn't. No color, all bones. The assistant district attorney echoed it a moment later with a legal pad and a glass of water I didn't touch. I've briefed crews in stranger rooms. The rhythm was the same. Keep your feet, give them the line you'd trust in smoke. The grand jury room was cooler than the hallway. I spoke the timeline like I was reading weather. The sentence Nolan dropped in my kitchen, the telehealth push, the HOA smear, the church pitch, the sting, Plan B, the Deepfake KYC, the cued e-deed, the whistleblower's drive. I watched pins move and faces keep their state-mandated neutrality. When they asked how I knew the KYC was false, I gave the lab's blink cadence, the mismatched reflections, the diner receipt time-stamped to cut the liveness clip in two. When they asked what I did when the HOA letter arrived, I said, photographed, time-stamped, preserved. From there, we crossed to an emergency civil hearing in a room with a flag that had seen more wind than these walls ever would. The judge reviewed the notary vendor's logs, the deepfake liveness video, my clinic baseline note, the trail cam timestamps, and the receipt from a diner that smelled like patience. He asked 2 questions, both short. Then he ruled. The quitclaim void from the start, injunctive relief against any guardianship or power of attorney filing attached to my name, and an order to lock my title pending the criminal case. Paper that had been used to take the house now held it in place. News crawled along the corridor televisions like ants finding sugar. Everguide's offices were being searched. 2 affiliate shells listed at mailbox suites were getting the same visit. A split screen showed a woman in a dark coat stepping into a car, head down. Dr. Serena Klein, face flat, hands invisible. A caption at the bottom warned viewers some images might be disturbing. The most disturbing thing was how ordinary it all looked. Calvin chose his corner of survival and took a proffer. Dana whispered, "He's naming splits and scripts." Rourke confirmed the fee ladders, the templated HOA language, the recruiter who fed Polly her targets. The telehealth doctor faced fraud and practicing on a suspension. The vendor announced cooperation as if it had been their first impulse. Systems that had been stitched together to close around people were now unspooling in the same measured clicks. The ADA stepped out to say writs were being signed in 2 counties. A slide appeared a few minutes later with photos of elders wheeled out in blankets, hair brushed by hands that were finally allowed to be kind. I felt a gravity shift, not dramatic, just the way a pack feels lighter when you remember to take the unnecessary thing out. The same nouns that had trapped people, observation, coordination, processing, were being used to open doors and send them home. Financial testimony rolled like a slow front moving in. The fraud unit at the bank laid out the micro-transfer reversals and the frozen merchant accounts. The lender entered a consent order admitting KYC compromise and promising better liveness checks and notifications to every borrower who might have been touched by the same hand. A restitution pool took shape on paper, funded by seized accounts, and a promise of more. I asked Dana to file my claim last. "You'll get paid," she said. "I know," I said. "File it last." The sheriff's report on Nolan came like a new page. Arrested on device tampering and attempted fraud, benzaldehyde finding its way from the lab into probable cause and then into a paragraph the judge could read without tripping. Grace stood in a side hall with a public defender, eyes swollen but dry, a manila envelope clutched to her chest. She signed a cooperation agreement. Her screenshots of texts with Calvin and Polly went under seal. I nodded once in her direction. No speeches. A boundary can be mercy when it's true. The HOA's counsel read a retraction into the record in a voice that sounded like a tire going soft. The judge ordered training and an outside review of how complaints are handled when concern dresses up as authority. The neighborhood group pinned a new post linking to the Attorney General's release. Someone uploaded a photo of my cabin in the snow and captioned it with the word home. I declined microphones. I didn't need to teach a lesson the paper could teach better. Dana spoke for the full. The file spoke for me. Mara Ellison, who had walked into a diner in fog to put her job on one side of the scale and other people's houses on the other, received temporary relocation and a confidentiality order. Her proffer was accepted. I shook her hand in a corridor that smelled like lemon cleaner and policy. Her spiral notebook belonged to the state now. Its pages had numbers on the bottom and a chain of custody in the margin. By dusk, I was back on Elk Ridge with a court order taped inside the desk drawer above the deed itself. The trail cam card had a new tag. The porch light threw a true circle on clean snow and made the world feel the right size again. I sharpened a new pencil for the ledger and dropped the old stub into a jar with spent matches, a small archive of burned doubts I could hold up to the window when memory tried to make everything softer than it was. A voicemail transcription arrived while I was rinsing my cup. High likelihood that she can't protect them all belonged to an Everguide executive whose name came redacted, traveling for business. Dana texted indictment imminent, travel flag issued. The words felt like a latch falling into its strike plate. I set the phone down and breathed the way I used to when a line held after an ugly wind. I wrote a letter to the administrator of the restitution pool. If or when funds came back to me, a portion should go to a legal aid clinic for seniors, another to Wyatt's search and rescue fund. It isn't charity to put resources where they keep the map true for someone else. It's maintenance. Upstairs in the loft, the suitcase stood upright, zipper open, empty. No flight left in it, only storage. Night radio hummed. The shortwave caught a weather band that said clearing, the voice thin and official, the forecast modest as good news ought to be. I stood with my palm on the topo map until the paper lay perfectly flat again. The map held, I said, into the quiet, not for effect, only to hear the truth in a room that could echo it back. Tomorrow I'd write what I learned for whoever needed it next. Tonight I let the house do the talking by simply staying where it belonged. Blue clear morning after the storm, sun laying clean angles across the switchback and a steady plume from the stovepipe. I stacked 3 folders, title and deed, KYC and bank, Everguide and scripts, into a fireproof pouch and slid it into the safe. I relabeled the ledger spine, swapped in longer screws at the front door, and tested the porch light timer until the click landed right. Dana called with the arithmetic of consequences. Indictments landed for an Everguide executive, for Dr. Klein, and for the HOA liaison who had lent medical language to rumor. Calvin's proffer matured into charges against recruiters. Polly entered a plea. The clerk confirmed my title lock. The lender terminated the file and flagged my profile as KYC compromised. The bank banned Calvin's merchant accounts. I printed each confirmation and taped a one-line summary inside the desk. Title secured, KYC flagged, network indicted. The HOA held a listening session at the library. I offered one paragraph about process over panic and suggested a checklist for complaints. Verify, document, then act. Neighbors nodded, some apologized. I accepted with a nod and nothing more. Online, the group pinned a post with hotlines, legal aid links, and credit-free steps, and Wyatt moderated so signal stayed loud. Grace texted a photograph of a new apartment key and said she had started meetings. I replied with 3 words: stay with truth, and set the phone face down. Nolan remained in custody. Arraignment set. The no-contact order held like a railing on ice. I turned to systems I could keep. I pinned a 1-page plan inside the pantry: mail handling, monthly router export, quarterly title search, consent to record, and a do not sign rule. I set calendar nudges, changed the Wi-Fi password, and replaced the shortwave antenna so the static sounded like clean air instead of worry. Then I distilled what mattered for whoever might need it next. My guide fit on 2 pages and wore a plain title: if they say it's for your protection. Document first. Timestamp everything. Don't argue. Record. Keep ID, deed copy, and a clinic baseline within reach. Red flags. Telehealth without licensure specifics. Temporary power of attorney that ends when a planner determines. Holding accounts with no named branch. Check the router's device list. Bag unfamiliar plugs. Expect social smears that borrow clinical language. Flip them with facts. I posted one neutral thread, a checklist graphic and 3 hotlines, no names, no blame, and watched it travel farther than any speech. For restitution, I signed forms sending a share to legal aid for seniors and to Wyatt's search and rescue fund, keeping a small reserve for Mara's relocation if permitted. Afternoon found me walking the property. Boot prints held sharp edges. The trail cam LED winked. Wind smelled of old pine. I carried the suitcase to the loft and set it with the camping gear. Object art complete. Inside, I flattened the topo map with my palm until the paper lay perfectly flat and said one quiet line to the room. We protect what we can name. The shortwave caught a weather band promising high pressure. I wrote the last entry of this story. House secure, system learned. Share the map. At dusk, the porch light clicked on and the circle it cast on snow looked like a boundary I could keep without lifting a hand. Routine felt like freedom. The HOA circulated the checklist as policy, the board scheduled trainings, and the moderator archived complaints with timestamps for whoever might need proof later. I sent the guide to the Attorney General's Victim Services Office and to the bank's fraud unit so hotlines could post it where frightened people look. In the end, what saves a life isn't rage or luck, it's clarity. A name written where it belongs, a date that holds under pressure, a voice steady enough to say no while the room tries to hurry a yes. Betrayal teaches that trust needs proof. Survival teaches that proof needs process. When the noise is loud, paper and patience are anchors. And when the map finally lies flat, the horizon is simple. Protect what you can name, share what you learned, and leave the door brighter for whoever comes next. If this ending moved you, tell us why. Which moment hit hardest? Drop a comment with your thoughts or a timestamp and share what you do in that situation. Your voice helps others spot warning signs and choose courage over silence. If you're new here, tap subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next story. Thanks for being part of this community. Where are you watching from and what lesson are you taking with you? Invite a friend who might need this message.